I don't know how intentional it was putting the oil and gas guys right at the end of the conference, but here we are. I would have thought maybe somewhere in the middle would have been better. Everyone comes in, talks about green, we talk about oil and gas, and they come back and give a positive message again. So we're here to talk about regulation and how do we use regulation to try and move towards sustainability and a green future. And regulation really is where we're talking about encouragement and we're talking about incentivizing that change, which I think underpins everything that everyone wants to achieve. The inevitable is the environmental factor, and I've put intersection in environment, economy, politics, and law, because I think this is quite an interesting area where all of these areas do meet, and you have to be able to tick them all off in order to be able to reach that sort of consensus to move forward in a positive manner. Environment is the obvious one. We have to decarbonize and we have to move towards net zero. We have to reduce pollution, and global warming is a serious concern. So we can take that as common ground. Economy is one of the most major factors that we have to think about. What is moving towards that change is going to inflict some cost on all of the players. So moving from hydrocarbons to greener fuels, to future fuels, to more sustainable fuels is going to have a cost, an inevitable cost. And the question is, how do we calculate for that cost? What do we do with that cost? Is it the ship owner that has to stomach that cost? Is it the charterer? So when they charter from A to B and they're taking goods or grains from one side of the world to the other, do we increase the cost on the charterers? Is it the farmers and the goods manufacturers? The charterers are going to increase their prices. They don't want to take on the cost of this increased cost of the fuels. So they'll probably pass it back to the farmers and the goods producers. And ultimately, is it the governments? And so there is an element here that cannot be ignored. How do we account for the additional cost? And so that's one of the other considerations. And that brings us quite nicely onto politics. How are the politicians going to deal with that? There has to be the political will, and that ultimately depends on electability. Are politicians going to stand for that change, knowing elections are around the corner? And obviously, environment is a very positive message for them to give, but they have to be able to pay for that. You've got politicians in the UK that are up for re-election, politicians in the US that are up for re-election. And we've actually seen this. It's not a theory. We've actually seen this happen and play out in reality, where with that political swing, the motivation for change can soften or it can become more serious. So you go from one US government, which doesn't really have as much interest in taking action on global warming, to another one which has real serious intent on that change, and then we're up for re-election again. Which way is it going to go? In the UK, another major economy, there's a cost of food crisis. So if we're increasing the cost, what people are purchasing at the supermarket, the government has to think, do I want to allow for that? So do I have that political will to push through this change at the speed that we want to see it? Because I've got a re-election coming up soon, and we don't want to lose that election to the other side. So there is an element here of politics which really cannot be ignored. This, you can see it play out at a macroeconomic and a microeconomic level. You can see it on a global scale, and you can see it on a country-by-country sort of basis. Even if we got everyone to agree on a consensus that we have to effect this change rapidly, I think the consensus is we have to effect change. But the speed is quite important. How quickly do we want to get there? There's again disparity. There's a developed world, they've already been there, done that, they've damaged the environment to be able to get there. There's the developing world that wants to get there, and we're telling them, no, you can't use hydrocarbons in order to be able to get there. You've got to go for the more expensive alternatives. So let's increase the cost of your development while we don't have that to worry about. So that's one factor. So there are the developing world countries to think about. Are they as interested in this change and the speed of this change? The other interesting thing there is, what is the domestic industry of each of these countries? Are we a ship owner country? Ship owners, countries such as Greece, where the predominant industry is ship owners, they're driven by a set of factors that benefit ship owners. Are we typically a charterer country? in which case we want to protect our charterers. Are we a farmer country? We want to make sure that farmers are protected. Are we an oil and gas industry? It's easy, for example, for a country like Germany to step forward and talk about oil and gas and pushing for change. They don't have any oil and gas to sell. They're only buying it. But it's a whole different matter when your economy relies quite heavily on your revenues from oil and gas. So diversification, which we see in the Middle East, I think, over the last few years, we've seen Middle Eastern countries really sort of push for this diversification of the economy. But you do have to factor for the amount of income stream that they have from the oil and gas sector. So are they as keen to see this change with the speed that, for example, let's say France or Germany want to see it, where they don't have as much production or any production of oil and gas? So that's on a global scale, is the consensus there and is the interest there for the same speed to be applied? And then there's the regulatory element, and I've put that last because regulators are the politicians. They're not somebody, they're not necessarily the lawyers that are sitting in law firms. They're not the judges in courts. The regulators are the politicians. You elect them, they go into parliament, and they pass laws. And it ties back into the economy and the politics. So if we want to see that regulation with the speed that we want to see it, are we going to see it? Because at the end of the day, are we voting for the right politicians to come in to effect that change? The regulatory change happens in parliaments. It doesn't happen in courts for most of the countries around the world. So those are the considerations around how do we get that regulatory change? How do we drive forward and at what speed? And the point there is that I think we need to be a little bit realistic about the speed at which this is going to be achieved if we want global consensus. Yes, there are countries that want to see it done a lot faster. There are countries that are not as keen to see it change as fast. They want to be able to catch up a little bit. So looking at things from a global perspective, the sort of easy answer there is to say we need global conventions. We need conventions, we need agreements between states. But again, for the reasons that I've explained, we've seen this play out a number of times in really simple industries where we don't have such serious considerations like the agriculture. The World Trade Organization spent years negotiating the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in order to be able to regulate what happens within the agricultural industry, and that's where everybody was aligned that we need to regulate how much tax countries can impose on each other's industries. So if we're not able to get there through international conventions where there is global consensus, and you can have international conventions as you typically do, where some countries don't join it. So if you don't get there with the global consensus that you want in order to be able to push for that change to happen as quickly as possible, what are the other tools that you might be able to see from a regulatory perspective? There you'll be able to see, I think, and this is quite likely that we might be able to see some of this over the next few years play out, organizations or regulatory bodies without necessarily that regulatory tooth might show up. So FATF is a very good example of how we've seen this play out over the last decade or so. Compliance was an issue that was more important to some of the jurisdictions and less important to some of the others. You couldn't get countries to come around the table to agree that compliance and transparency was as important in an equal manner for all the countries around the world. So what they did was they came up with the FATF. Now FATF doesn't have any ability to enforce its rules on people. But what the FATF can do is produce a white list or a green list, a grey list and a black list. And if you're on the black list, the FATF cannot do anything to you. They'll just put out a notice saying you're on a blacklist, you're not transparent. And then suddenly the developed world that has this interest to change will stop doing trade with you. And essentially through that sort of de facto process of coming up with organizations that come up with lists, that's another way that we might be able to see this change. And I think that's quite a possibility if everybody cannot get around the table to get that consensus for that speed. Generally, it's important for regulators, and I think this is another one of the considerations to think about, you just cannot have stick alone. You have to have stick and you have to have the carrot that goes with it. So you cannot just penalize lack of conformity. You have to incentivize that change. And that's quite important for the developed world to think about the developing world. This additional cost that we're trying to impose on them to effect this change that they may not necessarily be as interested in, maybe they'd be a whole lot more interested if they can afford it. On a domestic level, we've seen this in other industries. I think shipping is probably a little bit behind some of the others, possibly because of the scale of the economic impact it will have to have this change. Tariffs on emissions is one of the simplest ways of dealing with it, in terms of the penalties. If you're not complying with regulations on emissions and on efficiency, there'll be implications, there'll be penalties. What we haven't seen as much of is tax breaks, and this is where we're talking about governments coming in to incentivize change. You can't just penalize everyone into conformity. Well, you can, but you won't get everyone around the table. But I think if you incentivize change where it makes sense for people and their bottom line isn't as affected, then you'll see that change happen a lot faster. We've seen this happen in the other industries, in the car industry. Central London is a very good example of it. When they came out with a low emission zone, or with the congestion charging to reduce the number of cars that are coming in or to promote electric cars, through that scheme of penalizing and tax breaks, initially nobody was interested in electric cars. Going back 15 years ago, not as many people were interested in electric cars. But today, as people go out to purchase cars, they're thinking about, should I go for a petrol car? But if I do, then I won't be able to drive it into central London as easily. There'll be less parking spaces for me. So there's a penalty element for the charges that you have to pay, and there's an incentive that if you don't, then there'll be free parking, there'll be free access to central London, and there'll be easier movement. So there's a penalty and an incentivization. And we've seen that actually works. It works, and we're seeing it a little bit more in the shipping industry. In the EU, we've got regulations coming in, and so I think we'll probably see a little bit more of that. Finally, and I think this is a point that others have touched on, is we've got to be a little bit realistic about what we do with the existing fleet of ships. We're looking for new technologies to come in. We can talk about all of this new sort of future fuels and being able to use that for combustion of these new ships with the new tech that come in, but there are still ships being manufactured today that are relying on hydrocarbons. And if that's the case, typically they have a lifetime of 15, 25 years, depending on which country you're running them in. If you're looking at a 25-year lifespan of a ship that's 5 years old today still has another 20 years of economic activity. And so are we looking at technologies that burn fuel that the existing fleet cannot manage? Or should we be investing more and more in coming up with things where the existing fleet can also benefit from, so that there isn't this huge cost that goes into a black box and isn't accounted for? And I think the other speakers alluded to that, where we've got to invest a little bit more in R&D in that area.